It's hard to explain what it's like to be possessed. I felt my mind being pushed into a corner, as if locked in a room, unable to control what my body was doing. I tried to fight, to scream, but it was as if I were suffocating under a wave of mud. 3 fishermen, 3 terrifying stories at sea. Today, on the Echoes of Shadows channel, you'll discover what they found in the dark waters. Leave a comment if you've ever had a supernatural experience. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming stories. Thank you very much. Story 1: The Call of the Lost Souls.
I was born and raised in a small coastal town in Maine called Cutler. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and most people either work at the docks or have some connection to the sea. My dad was a fisherman, so from a young age, I got used to being out on the water. I tried a few other jobs, like working as a clerk at a local store, but I always found my way back to the ocean. I remember the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, pitch black outside, and I was alone on my little aluminum boat, the Sea Breeze. I always liked fishing in the early morning hours when the waters were still and the fish were more active. That night, I decided to try my luck near a small island that's pretty popular during the day, but completely deserted at night. Locals have always said that once the clock strikes 11, the place comes alive in ways no one can explain. I never paid attention to those stories. The moment I got close to the island, I knew something was wrong. The moon, which had been lighting up the sea, disappeared behind a thick fog that rolled in out of nowhere. The water, usually calm, started to churn, as if something huge was moving beneath the surface. Every instinct I had was screaming for me to turn back, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a change in the weather. Then I saw it, movement on the shore. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, and that's when I saw the first sign that the night would be different. In the middle of the twisted branches, a man was staring back at me. His face wasn't right. It looked like a mix of rotting flesh and exposed bone. When my light hit him, his jaw dropped, literally like it was unhinged, and he melted into the shadows. My hands started shaking, and I thought about starting the motor and getting out of there, but it just wouldn't start. Each time I turned the key, the engine coughed like a dying animal. That's when I heard the voice, a faint whisper, calling my name. "Mark." I looked around, but no one was there. The sound was coming from the middle of the ocean, and when I turned back to the front of the boat, there was a woman sitting there, pale skin, hair dripping wet, and wearing a torn white dress. "You know what you did," she murmured, and even though I didn't understand, I felt a crushing sense of guilt in my chest, a guilt I didn't even know I had. Then she lifted her head and opened her mouth, but there were no teeth, no tongue, just a hollow black void. I couldn't move. Every hair on my body was standing on end. The water around the boat started bubbling like it was boiling. The woman began crawling towards me, dragging her soaked body across the deck until I felt the icy touch of her hands on my ankle. She pulled with an impossible strength, and I crashed onto the floor of the boat. The stench of decay filled my nose, and before I could get up, she was gone. But I wasn't alone. In the water around me, I started to see faces. People who looked like they were screaming for help, but no sound came out. The water was like a twisted mirror, reflecting their despair. One by one, they began to rise. Hands, sticky and covered in seaweed, gripped the edge of my boat. I started swinging my oar, trying to push them away, but there were too many. I felt the boat sinking, weighed down by their impossible grip. Panic made me shout, but there was no response. It was like I had been cut off from the rest of the world, trapped in some dark pocket of reality. Finally, the motor roared to life. I tossed the oar aside and gunned it as hard as I could. The water felt like it was pulling the boat backward, as if some invisible current was trying to drag me back. The faces began to disappear, one by one, but the sound of their voices lingered. It was a chorus of pleas, people crying for help, and I knew it was all my fault. I just didn't know why. When I finally reached the dock, I collapsed on the ground. The flashlight I'd been holding was cracked, and the boat was covered in handprints that looked like they'd been burned into the metal. I never could figure out what happened that night, and after that, I never went back to that spot again. I told this story once to an old fisherman I knew. He looked at me seriously and said, "You saw them. The souls of those lost at sea who can't find peace." After that, he never mentioned it again, and neither did I. I keep trying to forget, but sometimes I still hear that whisper in the dead of night.
Story 2. The Spirit That Possessed Me.
My routine had always been the same. Leave the house at 4 in the morning, take my boat, and head down to the docks in Clearwater, Florida. But that night, everything changed. It had been a month since I lost my wife, Sarah, in a car accident. Since then, fishing had been the only thing that still made me feel alive. And maybe because I was so emotionally wrecked, I didn't notice the signs that night. I arrived at the docks as usual, and the place was deserted. The wind whistled between the anchored boats, swaying the ropes and creaking the wood as if the entire pier was about to groan at any moment. What was already eerie became worse when I noticed something unusual. All the dock lights were off except one, dim and flickering, near my boat. It felt like someone was guiding me there. Just in my head, I thought. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe I was imagining things. But as I got closer, I noticed a strange smell, like something rotten. A strong odor of spoiled fish mixed with blood? I stopped, trying to figure out where it was coming from. And then I saw something moving near my boat. A crouched figure, hunched over, fiddling with the ropes. I yelled out, asking who was there. But the figure didn't respond. It just stopped moving and slowly lifted its head. My heart raced. It was a woman, Sarah. It couldn't be, but she looked exactly like my wife. The same brown hair falling over her shoulders and that outfit she was wearing the day of the accident. Is it you?" I asked, my voice trembling, and she stood up, staring at me. But her eyes were empty, like two dark pools. A smile spread across her face, but it wasn't one of joy. It was cold, lifeless, like it was forced. As I took another step, the woman disappeared into the darkness, dissolving into the air. I ran to my boat, heart pounding, and that's when I felt a pressure on my back. Something cold brushing past me, like an invisible hand had touched my skin. A chill shot up my spine, and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. My feet felt glued to the ground, and a high-pitched ringing echoed in my ears. It was as if the sound came from inside my skull. My hands started to tremble. The smell of blood grew stronger, and suddenly I wasn't at the pier anymore. I was back on the day of the accident. I could see the car flipping, feel the pain, and hear Sarah next to me, screaming as the glass shattered and shards flew everywhere. I closed my eyes trying to escape the vision, but I couldn't. The pain was real, so intense my body felt like it was burning. I screamed for help, but there was no one there to hear me. When I opened my eyes again, the woman was right in front of me, just inches away. She wasn't Sarah anymore. Her face was swollen, her skin pale. She reached out her hand and placed it on my chest. An overwhelming cold surged through my body, and then I was taken. It's hard to explain what it feels like to be possessed. It's not like in the movies where you turn into someone else. It's more like being swallowed by an endless darkness. I felt my mind pushed into a corner, as if I was locked in a room, unable to control what my body did. I saw my own hands moving, but it wasn't me controlling them. I heard my voice, but it wasn't me speaking. Accept the pain. A guttural voice came from my throat, a voice that was never mine. I tried to fight, to scream, but it was like I was suffocating in a wave of mud, trapped beneath black water. My vision began to blur. All I could see was deep blackness, and within it, shadows, human shapes, twisted, writhing in agony. They moved closer, whispering things I couldn't understand, and as the shadows surrounded me, I felt an excruciating pain in my chest. It was as if someone had sunk sharp claws into my soul, trying to tear it out. The pain was so intense I felt my whole body curl up. Suddenly, I was on my knees on the dock, my nails scraping the wood until they bled. And then the spirit forced me to stand, walk to the edge of the boat, and look into the water. My head tilted and I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. It was the same figure that had possessed me. The face was disfigured, pale with completely black eyes, and behind me I saw Sarah, watching, tears streaming down her face. I tried to call out to her, but the pain cut me off. The shadow let out a final scream, a high-pitched, deafening sound, and then it released me. I collapsed onto the boat, gasping, my whole body shaking. I don't know how long I stayed there, but when I was finally able to move, daylight was starting to break. The smell had vanished, the figure was gone. But something inside me had changed. An emptiness, a sense of loss, like part of me had stayed behind on that dock. After that night, I was never the same. That spirit didn't just touch me, it took a piece of me. And I know one day it's coming back for the rest.
Story 3. Faces in the Water.
I've always been a simple guy. I was born and raised in a small fishing town in South Carolina called Murrells Inlet. Fishing was my life from a young age. I'd wake up early, prep my nets, and head out to sea. I'd heard stories from the locals about a specific spot, a stretch of water they called the Drowning Cove, but I never believed in any of it. They said many fishermen had disappeared there, and the ones who made it back always had some crazy story to tell. I just thought it was people trying to scare newcomers, until that night. The sea was calm, almost no wind at all. Seemed like a good night to try and catch a bit more to fill my quota. I got close to Drowning Cove around 11:30 without noticing anything unusual, just silence, the moon shining bright in the sky and the water reflecting its light like a mirror. I was getting ready to cast my net when I noticed something floating not too far away. I steered closer and saw that it was an old, rusted glass bottle. Inside was a piece of paper rolled up tightly. I picked it up, curious, and carefully unrolled it. The letters were smudged, but I could still make out what it said. "Don't go further. Turn back now." Chills ran down my spine, but I thought it was some kind of joke. Who would leave a note like that in the middle of the ocean? Things started getting really weird when I noticed the water around the boat was changing. It was bubbling, like something massive was shifting beneath me. The motor started stalling. I kept trying to start it, but it just wouldn't catch. The sound of the engine failing echoed, breaking that heavy silence. That's when I heard it, a low, muffled sound, like someone crying. I looked around and saw no one. The cove was empty, just me and my boat. But the crying continued, getting louder and louder. Then out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the water. Just a head at first, long black hair soaked and covering the face. It looked like a woman. She floated there, not making a sound, her body partially submerged. But there was something off about the way she moved, like there were no bones or muscle inside, just an empty shell being dragged along. I was frozen, couldn't even blink, and then slowly she lifted her head, but there were no eyes, no mouth, just two empty, hollow holes. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I took a step back and almost tripped. That's when she reached out, a bony hand with long, claw-like fingers. The crying sound shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was rage, like she was drowning again and again. She started coming toward me, gliding over the water. I ran to the motor, desperately trying to start it, but nothing. Every second she got closer. That sound, that high-pitched scream, seemed to be inside my head, making my hands shake so bad I almost dropped the keys. Then I felt it, something cold wrapped around my ankle. I looked down and saw a pale, scarred hand rising up from the side of the boat, pulling me toward the water. I screamed and kicked with all I had, but more hands started appearing. 1, 2, 5, 12. They crawled up the side of the boat, skeletal fingers gripping every surface they could find. I tried to fight back, but one of them grabbed my wrist with such force it felt like my bones would snap. In pure desperation, I grabbed the machete I always kept on the boat and started hacking away. But it didn't help. The hands had no blood, no flesh. It was like slicing through old, decaying ropes. They just crumbled away, and new ones took their place. The boat started sinking. The water rose fast, and I found myself surrounded by those figures. There were so many, all with the same hollow eyes, clawing their way toward me. I thought I was going to die right there, but suddenly the water began to thrash violently. The figures froze like they were listening to something, and then I saw it, a massive shadow passing beneath me, swift and fierce. It was like the sea itself was alive. The figures started retreating, vanishing one by one. Somehow the motor roared back to life. I didn't hesitate and sped out of there as fast as I could. The water felt like it was dragging the boat backward, like something was trying to keep me there. The faces started disappearing, but the sound of their cries lingered in the air. It was a chorus of voices begging for help, and I knew it was all my fault. I just didn't know why. When I finally reached the dock, I collapsed. The flashlight I'd been holding was cracked, and the boat was covered in scratches, like claws had torn into the metal. After that night, I never fished at Drowning Cove again, and I never will, because I know it's not just lost souls trapped there. There's something bigger, something worse, waiting for anyone foolish enough to challenge those cursed waters.